Horror games. What makes them scary? It may seem obvious, but it's a question that's worth discussing. After all, there are some games that are terrifying and others that miss the mark, so let's get started. First of all, to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves, what is fear? It may seem like a silly question, but investigating this thoroughly will be the key to answering our question. Like any emotion, fear serves a purpose. Namely, it arises as a response to a perceived threat of danger. So the first and most obvious takeaway, the player has to feel like they're in danger. Therefore, your horror game needs to have something that poses a danger to the player. Enter the monster. This is almost ubiquitous in horror games, be it ghosts, man-made abominations, or unknowable entities. Every good horror game has a monster, right? Well, it's more subtle than that. After all, there's plenty of games that put the player in danger and feature monsters of some kind, and yet we wouldn't consider these to be horror games. Conversely, there's plenty of other games that could be considered horror games that don't feature monsters or any real danger at all. What's going on here? Well, let's return to our observation about fear, that it arises from a perceived threat of danger. It turns out that it's the word perceived that's the key here. That is, the player doesn't necessarily have to be in actual danger, rather, they simply have to perceive a potential or a threat of danger. This is the difference that can begin to explain the most common tropes we see in horror games. There's a couple of different ways that developers can create this perception of a threat. Let's look at each of these in turn. The first method is by disempowering the player. After all, if your character is slow, weak, or unable to fight back, then you will naturally perceive the threat of danger to be higher than if the character is fast, strong, and well armed. One great example of the difference that this can make is, in my opinion, the Resident Evil series. In the first couple of games, your character was slow, had limited ammo, and was encumbered by the infamous tank controls. More subtly, the fixed camera angle also disempowers you, as you don't have the ability to look around corners and check for danger. All of this means that, despite being armed, it's difficult to fight back, lending these games their sense of fear. On the other hand, if we look at Resident Evil 4, your character is faster and easier to control, ammo is more abundant, and you can freely move the character. While this is a great game in its own right, in my opinion, it loses that fear factor for exactly these reasons. It's easier to fight back in these games, and so the player never feels that they're in as much danger as before. The next method that can be used to create a perception of danger is through a lack of information. After all, we naturally fear what we don't know or don't understand, as there's no way of judging how dangerous it might be. Viewed under this lens, a lot of the most common tropes in horror games, and indeed horror media in general, start to make sense. One example is the environment. Horror games usually take place in environments that through one means or another restrict the player's ability to perceive what's happening around them, be it through darkness, fog, or the tight corridors of a mansion or asylum. And when the player is unable to easily perceive their environment, this creates a sense of fear or anxiety, as there's no telling what might be hidden in the fog or around the corner. This is also why horror can work without any monsters. In an environment that restricts your ability to perceive your surroundings, there is still a potential threat of danger, and so this creates fear, even if no actual danger exists. Conversely, a monster that can be viewed plainly, in an open, well-lit space, isn't as scary. The next way that we can use a lack of information is through unpredictability. In other words, restricting one's knowledge of the exact nature of the danger. This can be done in many ways. The most obvious way is through timing, that is, making it unpredictable exactly when the monster is going to appear. After all, if you encounter monsters in every room, then it becomes predictable and no longer scary. On the other hand, if you never know exactly where the monster is or when it's going to jump out and get you, this builds a sense of tension over time. This is also where the jump scare trope comes in. While this is sometimes considered a cheap form of horror, it can be utilised effectively if the developer makes the effort to build tension leading up to the jump scare, so that the player knows that something is coming, they just don't know exactly what or when. While this is the most well-known use of unpredictability, it can also be created in other ways. For example, by making the exact nature of the monster unknown. Horror media commonly features monsters whose origins, powers, or motivations are unknown, and this is deliberate. After all, as mentioned earlier, we fear what we can't understand. This is also why, in my opinion, being killed by the monster in a horror game makes it less scary, as then we've learned the exact nature of what the danger is, and then next time it becomes predictable. Another trick that developers employ is to obscure the exact mechanics of the monster. If we knew exactly what causes the monster to appear, or when it might show up, then it loses some of its power, and so developers should ideally be vague about how the mechanics work, or even go so far as to mislead the player. This leads us into the final, and in my opinion, the most interesting method, and namely misdirection, or more bluntly, lying to the player. This may sound like a bad idea, but leading the player to believe certain facts about the game can actually help shape their experience to be scarier than if they had a full understanding of the mechanics of the game. One of the best examples of this is in Amnesia: The Dark Descent. Amnesia features a so-called sanity meter. Sanity can be lowered by things such as standing in darkness or seeing a monster. As your sanity drops, it causes a variety of effects to appear, such as auditory and visual hallucinations. The game goes out of its way to obscure the true nature and purpose of the sanity mechanic, leading players to believe that sanity could have a variety of negative effects. The thing is, this is false. In reality, the sanity meter has no mechanical effect on the game. As developer Thomas Grip states in an interview, "We had a sanity meter, which had some sanity effects, and then there was no real fail state, and it worked better. Then we don't say what the consequences are for this, but the player assumes if you're going to lose your mind, I'm not going to be able to play him. He might die, he might be harder to control, he might attract the attention of monsters, and so on and so forth." Another great example, although not coming from a horror game, is in Hellblade's Senua's Sacrifice. In this game, the lead character Senua suffers from a corruption of the flesh known as dark rot. Early on in the game, players are told that every time they let Senua die, this dark rot will spread further throughout her body. If the dark rot manages to spread all the way up to her head, then the player's save game will be permanently deleted. It turns out that this is a complete fabrication. Even if the player dies repeatedly, the rot will slow and eventually stop spreading completely, making it impossible for it to reach her head. Nevertheless, telling the players that they could potentially lose their save game if they die too much is an excellent way of creating a sense of tension and anxiety in the player, effectively reflecting the anxieties felt by Senua, who in the game's narrative suffers with a severe psychosis. In this way, misdirection, ambiguity, and outright lies can be effectively used to create a sense of uncertainty, anxiety, or fear in the player, which are the exact emotions that horror games aim to evoke. Therefore, this is one genre where it's not always a bad idea to lie to your players. And that's all of the methods I have for you. If there's one theme that runs through all of these, it's that a lack of agency or a lack of information are key to creating an effective horror atmosphere. And this makes sense. After all, these are the exact elements that define fear as an emotion. Any developer that takes care to keep these in mind, as well as utilizing any other techniques that play on these traits, is sure to find success in creating an effective horror game. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you're creating a horror game and you've been influenced by the advice in this video, then I'd love to see it, so be sure to come by to my Discord server to show it off. I'd also quickly like to remind you all that I have a Patreon, where if you become a patron, you can gain early access to my future videos, as well as access to project files and source code for all of the projects featured in my videos. Finally, if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.